But
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's.
So hello everyone, thank you for joining us our webinar on US immigration options. I am Mian Tariq Hassan. I am a partner at Access Law Chambers and I am also a partner at Absolute Legal Works. So I am joined here with Mr. Mark Popiel and Jitesh Malik, who are expert in the field of immigration in US immigration law. So we'll start with Mark. Why don't you introduce yourself and provide a little background about your firm?
Certainly. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Tariq. It's a pleasure to be on this and provide some insight on immigration. My name is Mark Popiel. I'm managing partner of our Buffalo, New York office. Our firm and my partner Jitesh Malik oversees our New York City office. Our firm predominantly focuses on employment-based immigration. That entails advising individuals, professionals, and employers from a small startup organization to multi-billion-dollar organizations. We counsel clients on the process for individuals coming to the U.S., both temporarily and permanently. And usually there's a process, so individuals come in temporarily, thereafter, after a period of time, qualify to file for permanent residency, which some call the green card process. And later on, they conclude their process by exploring pursuing citizenship in the US. And so our clients are fairly diverse, from research organizations, pharmaceutical companies, academic institutions, and just private employers and investors. We counsel clients on filing of temporary cases such as E's, H-1Bs, TNs, L's, and so forth. There's a whole host. Today's discussion is going to focus on a certain segment of the immigration process. But if anybody has additional questions, we are definitely more than able and welcome any discussion you may have in other areas that we can kind of provide you details. So with that being said, I think it's important, and Tariq, we're good to go?
Yes.
Okay. With that being said, I think it's important for everyone to understand the immigration framework. So first and foremost, we're going to discuss a couple areas, topics to be covered. We're going to look at terminology, and then in particular the framework itself. And then we're going to focus on temporary employment. And in today's discussion, we're going to look at the E2 process. There are other classifications out there. We can, like I said, discuss that. And then long-term planning, permanent residency. This will be through EB2, EB3, national interest waivers, and employment-based fifth preference category, which is a path for permanent residency by investment. To kind of give you an overview of the process, in employment-based cases, there are really three agencies that play a pivotal role. First being the Department of Labor. When we look at, for instance, filing cases under what is called perm, where an employer has to test the labor market to see if there are any U.S. qualified workers out there, Department of Labor is in essence spearheading that process. They set the wage where the employer must pay at or above a particular wage, and then they also oversee the recruitment, in that once the employer completes their labor market test, all the paperwork is submitted to the Department of Labor. If, for instance, you have a U.S. employer that files for H-1B, for instance, or there's another one for Australian nationals called E3 and so forth, there's a document called a labor condition application that has to be prepared. That is also processed with the Department of Labor. The next agency, which is, I would say, pivotal, is the USCIS. That's the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. It was formerly called the Bureau of Immigration Services, and before that was the INS. This organization is, in essence, the immigration agency that then will process and review paperwork that's submitted for both temporary and permanent employment. And then last but not least is the Department of State. They control the assignment of green card numbers. As you will discover in our discussion today, green cards or permanent residency allocation is based on country of birth and not citizenship. And so when you see backlogs, they're due in part to the fact that there are more people in certain lines from certain countries Department of State is the agency that controls it. They also actually control issuance of visas. So when you, for instance, process for an E2, which is an investor visa, or an H-1B, or any other non-immigrant, meaning temporary classifications, Department of State is actually the consular sort of arm of this process. So as we move forward, my partner Jitesh will take over the E2.
Yes, thank you, Mark.
You're welcome.
You for arranging all of this. It's a wonderful session. Now, when it comes to, so like Mark said, we have temporary and permanent options available. So it's always important to gauge all of those options available to any individual or a company coming from abroad. Now, it all depends on the on the country of birth. Also plays a very important part in the processing of these particular visas, whether it's a temporary visa or a permanent green card. Permanent residency, which we brought the term in the previous slide, it refers to green card. So don't get confused. Permanent residency means you're permanently here on a green card basis.
Or should be.
Should be. Now, coming to the, so there are a couple of options for temporary visas. Either you come and work for an employer, and there are various options which Mark, highlighted, like an H-1B or a TN or a E3. So there are various options. Okay, when you come from abroad to the U.S. employer and work here for the U.S. employer, and you get paid as per the law. Okay, but so that's the when you have an employment from a U.S. employer. The second option is you come from a country which has a treaty with the U.S. Okay, that allows investors to come in, and Pakistan falls into that category because Pakistan has a treaty with the US, which allows the investors to come from Pakistan and invest here. Now, this is a very important category. Okay, only 29, 30 countries have treaties, treaty like this E-treaty, it's called E-treaty, where the citizens of these countries can come. It doesn't base it on the country of birth, but it bases itself on country of citizenship. So if you're a citizen of Pakistan, no matter where you were born, you can utilize this category called E2 and come to
Can you increase your volume?
Yeah, come to the US as an investor. Now, like I said, you must be a citizen of a treaty country, which Pakistan is, and you must be coming here to work in the US and invest and become an investor of at least 51% ownership of the US corporation. Now, there are two options. You can either purchase an existing corporation and become a 51% owner of that company, or you can start fresh, a fresh corporation. We can help you register the US corporation in the US. You will have to outline in a business plan what you intend to do in the business in the US. It's very important because the government wants to see what you really want to invest in. How are you going to create jobs? Because keep in mind, this whole idea of investors coming into the US is geared towards creating jobs in the US. So that's the only thing the government gets out of you, that you come here, invest your money, you get yourself visas, you run your business, but the government only gets that you create employment for the US people also. That's very important part of the whole investment program. You can be you can be an executive or a supervisor. Some companies are also allowed as a treaty investor company, and you can come as an essential employee. Mark, next slide, please.
Yep. The other point, and there's a question on it, the list of treaty countries. If you go on the U.S. Department of State website and just put in E2 treaty countries, there's an entire list of countries where people are able to come through.
Or maybe, Tariq, I'll send it to you, the list of countries, and maybe you can forward it to the folks also. Okay.
Okay.
But
Sure.
most it's typically it's Canada. Most.
There's a whole list of them, and there's E2 and E1 also. So you have to just look at those. Yeah.
So initially, if we are processing the E2 paperwork, you can come, you can get a visa from the U.S. consulate in Karachi or Islamabad. and get the visa for up to 5 years. They can grant you the visa. But each time you come into the US, you'll be allowed only 2 years of stay. And they want to make sure you are running the business and employing the people, like you said, in your business plan and the actual filing also. If you're buying an existing business from somebody, whether it's 51% or more, you will have to get a valuation report from a recognized valuator also, because the government also wants to know what's the real value of that business, that you're not inflating the value of the business. So business plan is a must, where you outline what you're going to be doing for the next 5-10 years. Valuation reports are a must, and then based on those two documents and based on the funds coming. So that's another very important, crucial part. You have to establish where the funds are coming from. You have to establish the entire chain. If you're getting a gift from somebody, the government wants to see their tax return, their bank statements. If you're getting a loan from somebody, then the government wants to see their tax returns. At the end of the day, legitimate white money has to come from abroad. It's very important. The money can't show up in your account one fine morning. It has to be documented and established where the money is coming from. So, and that's the crucial. Most of the cases where the issue happens is on the chain of money coming into the US, because people get the money all of a sudden in their bank account and they can establish where the money came from. Minimum investment for E2 is around 120,000 US dollars. You must invest that money.
Mr. Malik, can you speak up a little bit? People can't hear you properly. So minimum investment you were saying was
120.
120.
That's just a suggestion, though. Under regulation, there's when you look at an EB5, which we'll discuss in a minute, versus E2, and EB5, there's an actual amount that the government lists. Under regulations for E2, there is not. But we use, because a lot of times people want sort of, well, what's a dollar figure? We file a lot of the E2s, so we find successful cases are normally north of 120 or so. Could a person invest 60,000? Possibly. I mean, the law does allow it, but it will possibly maybe make it challenging, because the government obviously wants to see substantial investment. The regulations, in essence, say it has to be substantial investment based on the industry that the person is seeking to expand into. So as a means of example, if I'm actually building a service-oriented company, my 100,000 or 120,000 may be viewed as substantial. If, for instance, I'm seeking to build a business that is going to manufacture airplanes, my 100,000 or 120,000 is probably not even going to cover a windshield on an airplane. So, you know, you may need more money depending on the industry that a person is seeking to come into.
Yeah,
So like in this range of like 120,000, what's like a good industry in your experience, which you've seen
I
people
mean,
investing
it
money?
all depends what kind of interest the client has. I mean, if they are running an IT company, for example, you can tell them to go and buy a hotel for $250,000, correct? Because that's not their interest. So could they buy an existing IT company, or could they create a new IT company in the US? So it all depends on their interest, and this 120,000 is just the bare minimum. You don't want to get stuck to this number. Again, what Mark just said, it's based on the industry, what you're getting into. And some people can invest more also based on the industry and based on the type of work. Not everybody wants to buy a hotel, motel, convenience store or something, but some people want to buy that. That's fine too.
Right.
So
we have
clients who have invested in pharmaceutical companies, on pharmacies, on hotels, on IT companies, all sorts of,
landscaping companies.
All sorts of businesses.
So it has to be a legitimate business at the end of the day.
At the end of the day, any business you can think of and you can invest and you can run it, create employment, you're good to go.
Yeah, the other point to take away from is, and Jitesh alluded to this, is that normally, a strong and successful case is also based on the fact that the person who's investing has had some knowledge or experience in that area. Because the government will say, right, or they have the ability to say, okay, you're investing in this particular business, but what skills or what experience do you have in this industry? How are you going to, in essence, you know, the investment itself isn't actually the entire threshold of qualifying. Investing is one thing, but you're supposed to oversee this business. And if you have no knowledge in this business, the government's going to say, well, how qualified are you to actually do that?
Yeah, so you actually have to run the show. You can't be
Right.
not a passive investment. Keep that in
Right.
mind, everybody. Please keep that in mind. It's not like you invest, you buy. It's your baby. Now you're running the business, so you better be involved in it. And next time, if you're not involved, the government, whenever you go for visa processing, they will say, okay, how many people are on the payroll? So be very careful. If you want your spouse to get the E2 and you can get work authorization based on that too, the spouse better have knowledge of the entire operation and how many people are working, where is the revenue coming from, all those crucial questions, because, you know, if the consulate ask those questions, you know, you don't want to have no answers. They say,
Right.
you know, so you better be involved, actively involved. The term is actively involved in the business, in running the business, day-to-day business.
And the other point also is that this investment cannot be what the government terms marginal, meaning I'm investing this money to get work authorization for myself and my family, and I'm not growing the business. I mean, the last point here on the slide, we say this is obviously practical considerations once again. So do you have to have 5 full-time jobs in 6 months? Under regulations, no, but is it suggested that you build the business, that you actually have employees, you know, as you develop this business? Yes, because if you simply start a business just to support yourself and family, the government will say that this is not sufficient, because as Jitesh pointed out, this is in essence a job creation path. And so you definitely need to get employees in this business as it grows. And many of these businesses, I mean, that we've been instrumental, we've seen successful growth. I mean, there's a whole host of areas. I used, you know, landscaping. I can tell you that years ago, we represented these folks from Canada who decided they had a landscaping business in Canada and moved to Florida. And they started with, you know, somewhere around $120,000 and a few employees. They purchased a pre-existing business. And years later, I think 10 years later, they're like $5 million in revenues each year, because they've developed, you know, expanded into, you know, doing landscaping, architectural stuff, and so forth. So it can start from a small business and just grow. And so it just, you know, you need to kind of pick a business that you feel will be successful.
And the other part is the E2. The primary person can come on E2, the family can come on as an E2 dependent, the kids under 21 can come. The spouses of the primary individual can also get work authorization. So he or she can work anywhere in the US as well. So that's
very crucial.
Yeah, and the kids can, and the children can go to the local public school also once they are here, you know, at no cost. Most of the time it's no cost.
Right.
So we have a question from Mr. Wahid. How much time will it take to apply for the immigration visa in EB2?
Yeah, we'll address it when we get to that one.
No, I think he's talking about E2, not EB2. So I think for E2, if you start it, I think within 6 months or so, you should get an appointment at the consulate. Of course, we need time to prepare and do the business plan, and you need to find the business. Once you have identified the business, I think the typical time frame is around 5-6 months in order to get the paperwork done and in order to get the appointment at the U.S. consulate in Islamabad. So around 6 months or so. So I hope that answers his question.
And practical considerations, and this is also important to kind of understand how the process works. So so you may have 2 instances. You have an individual who is outside the U.S. You have an individual who happened to come in as a visitor and wants to now pursue an E2. You can file an E2 petition either at the U.S. consulate in the home country, and you can file a E2 petition with the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services in the U.S. What happens in each instance? So when you file, if you're in the U.S., you can file to change your status from a visitor to an E2 investor. If you're successful, you get a E2 approval, it will run for 2 years. The problem with that approach is that while you have the approval that allows you to stay here and oversee your business for 2 years, if you actually intend to travel overseas at any point, you know, for anybody who is familiar with the H-1B process, you normally just take the H-1B approval notice to the consulate, make an appointment for a visa, and then get that visa based on the approval notice. In E2, it's a little bit different. You actually can't use the approval notice to get yourself an E2 visa. You'd have to apply and petition with the full E2 petition all over again at the consular level. So from the practical perspective, costs also, what normally you want to do is you want to present the E2 petition directly at the consulate to get yourself the visa. And it's important to also understand a visa is merely a travel document. It's kind of like if you think of a boarding pass, that's what a visa is. And you need to have a visa in order to be able to travel back and forth between the US and internationally. So by filing with the consulate, normally you will get a 5-year visa. And the way it works is every single time you come to the US, they normally will admit you for a 2-year period. And when you go back outside and come back in, they'll give you another 2 more. So it's like a circular sort of thing. So it's definitely important to structure your filing depending on what your needs are. Some people come in, they don't plan on traveling, and if they're here as a visitor, they don't mind converting their status or changing it from a B2 to an E2. But others who plan on traveling definitely should look at, you know, filing at the consulate, because it will make their lives a lot easier.
One more thing I just want to add to the people who have children going to school or colleges. Children are only covered up to 21 years of age, and before that age arrives, you have to make sure they stay in status. So you either have to change their status to a student visa, which you can, or based on their profile, they could even get a employment work visa from a US company. Or if you have already started the green card process, then they should be able to stay under your green card filing.
That's the goal. Whenever we look at cases, we obviously want to process
very
family.
important. If your children are teenagers, you need to plan it now.
I think that's a very important question. So a lot of people in Pakistan, children who are in their mid-teen, they're like 14, 15 years old, they're looking for college options from going from Pakistan to the US, the conversion rate is so high. So they're looking for like state university rates, and I think E2 visa is a great way to like qualify for that. You set up your business, your children are eligible to go to school, and it's a win-win situation in that regard.
Absolutely. So that's the reason I brought it up, because you know timing is crucial. You know, especially if you want your children to study here in the US. The earlier you start the process, the better it is. Yes.
Yeah, for permanent residency, the path has to be explored depending on the circumstances, because E2 is not a direct path for permanent residency. You know, if there's a spouse and the spouse has work authorization and the spouse is then able to be sponsored by a third party company, then normally that would be a cleaner path that the entire family will process under permanent residency through that. We will discuss EB5. The one sort of classification that we didn't put on the slide to discuss fully, but people have to be also mindful. Aside from E2, there's one called L1, intracompany transfer. And so the way to look at L1s, if you have a company in Pakistan and your company overseas is seeking to create a satellite office or a subsidiary in the US, you can actually, similar to an E2, you can, invest and create a company in the US that's a sister company. And then those individuals are, you don't actually have to be an investor. So there's a path for L1s as multinational managers or executives that can come in as an L1A, and specialized knowledge personnel can come as L1Bs. And so there is a different path. It's structured differently, but ultimately the end result is the same. Spouses also can work. And so it's definitely something to also consider, because E2 is not the only one out there.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. That's makes sense. So, coming back to the E2 visa, I think one question which we encounter a lot from our clients is the timing of the investment. Because in Pakistan, there's a lot of concern about people not getting their visas. So they ask us what happens if our visa gets rejected and we've already made the investment? So
No,
what do
so I can answer that, Tariq. So sometimes, and it depends on the deal they are getting into. If they are buying an existing business, for example, they may have an option, okay, where they could approach the seller of the business and make a deal where they would still send the money from Pakistan to the US, but they will send it to their attorney in the US. And the attorney will put those funds, supposing if somebody XYZ is buying a business for $200,000, they will send the $200,000 to the attorney who's representing the buyer from Pakistan. He or she will put the funds into his or her escrow account. Okay. And the deal will be made like the moment the person XYZ gets the visa at the US consulate in Islamabad, the funds will be released from the attorney to the seller. So from the escrow account to the seller. Now that takes care of three things. One is consulate understands that, okay, visa is very important, but they also get the feeling that the buyer is very serious, and that's why XYZ has transferred $200,000 to their attorney. And the seller is also comfortable the moment the visa is granted. There is no going back and forth. The attorney will automatically next morning wire the funds to the seller right away to close the deal. Okay, but
Yes,
again,
the deal is conditional.
Conditional, but it doesn't happen in every deal, because the sellers, why would they want to wait for 6 months for you to get a visa? Why would they postpone the deal? Correct. So it's very important when you are looking for deals, talk to the seller in advance saying, okay, I'm very much interested in buying this business, but can you close it after I get the visa? So have that kind of a discussion early on so that you don't waste time, you don't waste their time. And
Makes sense. Yeah. So from point go, you know exactly what you're getting into.
correct. And the moment the visa is granted, their funds are released to the seller, and you are absolutely fine. The seller has the funds, you have the visa, you come here, take over, and start running the business.
So generally, what do you recommend, or it doesn't make a difference that buying a 51% stake or like starting a fresh business?
It all depends on what their interest is. If they want to start fresh, if they have ideas, if they've been running a business in Pakistan, maybe they want to start a business fresh instead of buying.
And it also depends on control.
Yeah.
If a person's investing money and they want to have full control, it makes more sense to start the business from the ground up.
But again, if you're starting the business from ground up, again, you have no way of knowing whether you'll be granted visa or not. Probably yes, you will be granted. Otherwise, if you take all those steps, of highlighting and establishing that you're investing money, that you'll be creating, your business will be creating jobs and all those things. But you are taking a risk because, you have to invest in the office space. You have to, start the entire structure. You can't say, oh, I've transferred the $200,000 to my US bank account and give me the visa. They won't give it to you. They want to see what steps have you actually taken or made.
That's why purchasing a pre-existing business has its advantages, because most notably they're usually employees. And so you address the issue I mentioned before, marginality, right? That you're creating a business solely for yourself and family. If you're buying a pre-existing business with employees, you've already shown or are able to show to the government that, well, hang on, I'm buying this business and this business already has 4 employees. That is already addressing that point that it's much bigger than just simply for yourself.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So again, it all depends on their interest, but I think starting a new business is doable, but they need to be very clear. Plus, they need to start investing the money. They can't say, oh, one day when I get the visa, then I will go to the US and start investing. They have to take a few steps beforehand.
Yeah. And in today's day and age, with the internet, you have like a lot of reliable options where you can just go online and look for businesses. And then
No, I mean, for that, you know what? It's always better. Number one, it's now that's a very important question you raised. Again, if they have family, okay, do they want to be closer to the family? I mean, US is so big, so huge, you know. Whether you whether you want warm weather, cold weather, you know. So it all depends where you want to go. You can't find a business, you know, sitting in Pakistan. Okay, you know, you if you want to move to California or Texas or New York, you need to find a business broker in those areas. And that also, California is so huge, you know, several countries can fit in California. Now, where in California? That's also a crucial question. If you have family in Los Angeles, then you want to be closer to Los Angeles, or you want to be closer to San Diego. That's 8 hours apart, you know, or 3 hours apart. San Diego is 3 hours away. If you want to be San Francisco, that's another 6, 7, 8 hours away. So you need to be careful. So if
You have to also look at states you want to expand in. Certain states have
Plus-
different taxation structures.
Yeah, that's
You
very
know, and how you even before we even get there, how you set up a business. It's important to talk to a U.S. accountant and understand sort of how if you structure a business as a incorporated business or an S corp. There's a number of different type of businesses. How you're going to be taxed. So all these things need to be pre-planning is key here.
So Texas has, you know, on some basis, no state tax. Delaware has sometimes no state tax. Las Vegas has, you know, Nevada has no state tax. So you need to figure out where your business will survive and expand, and you know, and you'll be able to save money. Plus, again, you know, are you want to be in that area or not? You know, is it too hot? Is it too cold? You know, do you have family? All those considerations are important, correct?
absolutely. So that so doing the proper homework is very
Yeah,
important.
plus if you want to, if you say, okay, I definitely want Los Angeles area, so then you need to look for a business broker in LA area and find out what businesses are for sale. There may be 5,000 businesses for sale there, but then you need to work with a business broker.
Business broker, understood. That makes sense.
Once you have identified the business, then we get into the picture and then we guide you what to be done, what needs to be done, and all those things. But we can certainly introduce you to US-based accountants. You can take their help. You know, of course, they charge nominal fee, but you can take their help in understanding the tax structure, very important, you know, wherever you want to live and work. And then that way you have an idea, okay, where do I want to move?
Absolutely. So that makes sense.
Okay. Are we all clear on that?
Anybody has any question? We can also, you know, translate it in Urdu if you want. Anybody?
All right. Well, we can always come back to it. So moving things forward, we're going to look at a little, you know, permanent residency. We put this up just so everybody can kind of see and understand the process. The way to understand permanent residency in the U.S., it's kind of like an immigration pyramid. The higher up on the pyramid you are, there should be less people applying, and the process should be quicker. So a lot of times you'll hear reference to EB1, EB2, EB3. What does that mean? Well, EB stands for employment-based, either first, second, or third preference. Employment-based first preference, we call them priority workers. Within it, you have three subgroups. You have extraordinary ability individuals. So those are filings where if you've obtained a Nobel Prize, and I use that not as an example, but that's actually how it's actually written in the regulations. So if you're a Nobel Prize winner, you may pursue extraordinary ability. If you have still high qualifications, probably the way to look at it is if you deem yourself to be in the top maybe 5% of the discipline, you can do a lesser count. There's 10 areas that the government looks at, and you have to meet at least 3 just merely to file. Then below that, you have outstanding professors and researchers. Clearly, as the term goes, outstanding professors typically would process through academic institutions. Outstanding researchers, however, could process under this if you're in the private sector and you're with a company that employs at least 3 full-time researchers. So where we've seen this is you have a pharmaceutical company, they do research, development, and so forth. They have at least 3 full-time scientists who are publishing. That may be an avenue. And then last but not least, and we alluded to it earlier in the slide before that, L1A managers, executives. So if you have a company in Pakistan that's expanded to the US and is now developing itself bigger and bigger, and you have multinational managers or executives who came to the US, EB1 could be, and we do a lot of these, EB1 could be the option. Below that, you have EB2, employment-based second. This is, in essence, professionals with advanced degrees. With advanced degree equals a master's or higher in a particular discipline. We will also get into national interest waiver filings. Those are also EB2s because they require a person to have a master's or equivalent qualifications for that master's. And then EB3s are skilled or professional workers. Those are filings for where the company requires at least a bachelor's or higher for a particular position. So that's the structure. Now, EB1s don't require perm labor certification, meaning if you qualify for EB1, you can directly go and file with the Immigration Service for the benefits you're seeking. In other instances, except the national interest waiver, for EB2 and EB3, you have to file under a perm process. And this intakes, in essence, is called perm labor certification, where the employer, it's a U.S. employer, would test the labor market to see if there are any minimally qualified U.S. workers, not in the United States. It's based on those who apply. And that's actually very important to understand. So we do not have to prove that there's no U.S. worker in the U.S. for the position you are seeking to fill. The employer needs to, in essence, prove that based on the advertisement, and you'll see it in a minute, we'll kind of show you where the government requires individuals to place advertisements. But based on the applicant pool, the employer has to establish for the government whether there are any minimally qualified U.S. workers. So under perm process, there are 3 stages. First stage is dealing with the Department of Labor, the perm process, testing the labor market. Once we clear that stage, we then would go and file paperwork with the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS. And then once that is done, and actually at the same time, if a person is in the United States, you can file paperwork, which is called adjustment of status, seeking to adjust or change a person's status from temporary to permanent. Or if a person is still outside the U.S., we would be doing consular processing. At the end of 3rd stage, that's where you actually get permanent residency in the U.S. So
now timing, if I may add, especially for people born in Pakistan, it's a little bit faster to process the green card through labor certification, but it could still take closer to, I would say, 3 years, if not more. So, it's faster than a lot of other countries, but it could still take 3 years because it's a permanent green card. They take their own time. The Department of Labor takes almost 2 years these days to approve these cases. There's a process to it. And then the Immigration Service also takes their own time in processing because they do a lot of background checks, criminal background checks, and all sorts of checks because they're granting green card to a foreign national. And this is their opportunity to do all kinds of background checks before they actually grant the green card. That's the 3rd stage. What Mark just said, it has 2 options. If you're in the US, you file to adjust status here. That means if you're in, temporary visa category in the US, then you can file the adjustment of status here. That, okay, I'm here in the US, please adjust my status to green card. Or if you're still in Pakistan, you could go to the consulate and they will process the final stage of the green card, and they'll give you the green card right there, the immigrant visa. It's also called immigrant visa. Yeah. Mark, you want to do the next slide?
yeah, so the other sort of piece to what we look at from our perspective, sometimes people may have the option of maybe doing an EB1A, which is extraordinary ability, or doing a perm process, or in some instances, national interest waiver. Why would you pick one versus another? if I was to pick a one word that controls everything, I would say discretion is what controls really what path one may or may not take. What I mean by that is in filing a national interest waiver or extraordinary ability or outstanding professor researcher case, the U.S. government has the ultimate discretion to determine whether or not you are, number one, pursuing, going to be providing services that are in furtherance of national goals and objectives of the U.S., which is what the NIW, or whether a person is deemed to be extraordinary ability or an outstanding researcher. In the perm process, while the government still has discretion, much of the discretion actually shifts over to the employer, because in this process, the employer, in essence, sets the minimum requirements of the position based on what they feel are minimum for the specialized position that they're seeking to fill. And so once the employer sets those requirements, unless they're excessive, and that we obviously counsel employers what the Department of Labor deems to be realistic and normal, versus sometimes employers want to stick in way too much. And so that's a give and take there. But so long as the requirements are viewed to be normal, the discretion really is in the hands of the employer, because they test the labor market. They use their requirements as the baseline. And so while this process may be slightly slower, you may actually be able to obtain a successful outcome if you pursue perm versus the other ones. And like I said, it depends on circumstances and person's qualifications. So, that you just have to kind of understand that there's different paths. So when we look at perm process, in perm labor certification, where we test the market, there are a couple things to understand. Number one is, what's the standard? So the standard in essence says that the employer is required to establish to the Department of Labor that has carried out a recruitment effort that has been a real world attempt to identify, and we've got this underlined bold, minimally qualified U.S. workers for the job. What does that mean? Well, in the advertisement, the employer needs to list what the minimum requirements are. So for instance, if the minimum requirement is a bachelor's degree with 2 years of experience in particular skill set, those would then be the minimum requirement. It could be a master's degree, but it depends really on the position. And so once you have the advertisement, the first thing that has to be done is we have to file for a wage determination from the Department of Labor. These days, they're taking around 6 months to get a wage determination. And the Department of Labor will set a wage for that position that will sort of say, if you're going to proceed and sponsor a person, you as the employer have to pay at least a base minimum of X amount. Once you have the wage determination, normally you would want to actually then have the employer test the labor market. So in testing labor market, they will place a job order. Each state has a workforce agency, we call it job bank. There has to be a job bank ad placed for 30 days. And then the employer needs to place 2 advertisements on 2 different Sundays in a newspaper of general circulation. In essence, the biggest paper in that area. Aside from that, when the position is for a professional position, there are other things that need to be done. So number one is a notice has to be placed internally. That is in essence notifying employees that the employer is pursuing permanent residency. And then there has to be, for any position that requires a bachelor's or higher, an employer is required to place 3 additional ads out of a list of 10. So it could be in job fairs, employer's website, on-campus recruiting, job search websites, and so forth. You see all these private employment fairs, you have to have at least 3 out of those. So there's a whole host of places where these ads need to be placed to test the market. And so after that, the employer, will have to wait to see if anybody applies. The way this works is, from the posting of the first advertisement, the employer must conclude this process, meaning if it's successful, the employer needs to, submit the paperwork with the Department of Labor within not more than 180 days. So it's time sensitive. And the law also requires that the employer needs to wait at least 30 days from the last posting to enable candidates to apply. And the reason they do that is because if you did all the postings and everything ended, yesterday, today you're actually filing with the government saying, you know what, nobody applied. Well, you never gave them enough opportunity. And so this is why it's important that, you have a 30-day cool-off period. If there are minimally U.S. workers that are found, the employer, for instance, doesn't have to hire them. The only thing that doesn't happen is the employer can't file perm labor certification with the Department of Labor, because in essence they are, by filing it, telling the government that they were unable to find any U.S. workers. If the person is already working, then with this employer, they don't have to be fired. The employer just, in essence, just cannot proceed forward to file the perm paperwork. And if there are U.S. workers that are found, the employer has to wait normally 6 months before they can restart the process, if that is the decision. There's maintenance of documents. You have to have it for at least 5 years and so forth. So this is most of the time what I would say is, if attorneys are hired, attorneys walk and inform the employer and walk them through this process. It sounds complicated, and it has complications to it, but it's actually fairly straightforward in what we do. So, any questions to that?
No, I think we can roll on to the NIW
Okay.
section. Yeah, I think
National interest waivers. In essence, this process is another sort of caveat of how people can pursue permanent residency. NIW, if you can qualify through it, absolves you from having to do the perm labor certification. And there's really, there are 3 sort of areas that the government looks at in order to qualify. So the first one is, they look at, the area that you are seeking to work in. Does it have substantial merit, and is it of national importance? So you have to establish that, what you're doing is a notable area, and it's in essence in fields among business, science, technology, and so forth. Second is that you're well positioned to advance this proposed endeavor. So what this means is, so if I'm an engineer, clearly I think you can establish the first prong that, I'm in an area that obviously has importance and so forth to the United States. If I'm outside the US, the challenge here is how to establish that you're well positioned to advance the endeavor. Because if you don't actually have a US job, the government many times can come back and say, well, how are you going to be able to, sir, you're an engineer and you have experience in this area, in the particular field, but how are you going to pursue this in the US? Because the focus is what national goals and objectives and contributions you're going to make to the US, not just simply in the field itself. And so that's one area to look at. And then last but not least, the government says, on balance, what do you bring to the table that's different that would, in essence, absolve you from having to do the labor certification process? Most commonly, when we do cases like this, in the third prong, we actually would include letters from government agencies or a person's employer in the US, or employers or end clients that they've worked for that are connected to, for instance, state or federal projects, to show that, as an example to put out there, if I'm a engineer and I'm involved in renewable energy, the White House, Department of Energy, among other agencies, publish their sort of goals and objectives that they want the country to be pursuing, renewable energy and so forth. And you have to connect those things to those are sort of the national goals and objectives. And then also provide evidence and examples of what you've already done, what you've developed or designed, and how that furthers those national goals and objectives. And so the NIW on its face may seem like it's an easy path, and people do process for it, but it also depends on the circumstances that you are able to support and substantiate it, because simply making statements to the government without support is not going to get a successful case. So the key is really to be able to look at different paths and decide which is actually better for me, what fits sort of my profile, and where am I going to be more successful, and what path will that take. Any questions on that?
That's really helpful, and you really clarified this. So, like, one thought which comes to mind is like, how difficult is it to satisfy these standards? Because like in Pakistan right now, a lot of people are like talking about national interest waiver. So, in that context, how difficult is it to satisfy these 3 requirements?
Yeah, I mean, I think the entire process has challenges, but is it difficult? I mean, the way to look at it is there are different officers with different sort of, some are more stringent, some are more open. I think simply having experience in a particular field doesn't actually establish an NIW. Experience itself, while it is something that is considered, you have to meet these prongs. And so simply, unless you're developing something that is unique and you can establish it's beneficial, that absolves you from the labor certification process, that would in essence be challenging. So if you're in a computer field and you have, 15 years of experience, that unless there's something unique that you've been involved in that you can say, well, when I come to the US, this is how I'm going to be, you want to distinguish yourself from the rest. Most commonly, the perm labor certification process would be probably the more preferred path. You can certainly file an NIW, but because of the government's ultimate discretion, NIW may not be the only, or the most ideal path one can take.
At the end of the day, we need to show what cutting edge contribution is the person going to make. I mean, that's typically the way to look at it, because why would they waive the labor certification process for you? Because it hurts the US workers. So what are you doing which is so beneficial to the US? It's very important. So you
That's
have
a very important, like,
something cutting edge, unique, advanced, very advanced, specialized. Okay.
Okay. There's some actually questions, I think, as well.
Somebody raised the hand. Yeah, you can go ahead.
Now, if you click on actually the chat, there's some questions there.
Yeah, I've already answered.
Okay, you've answered that?
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah, those are
All right.
like specific questions. So I've shared the email address where they can email their profile
Gotcha.
and
Okay.
evaluate.
And everybody, please feel free to reach out to Tariq and with your.
All right, Jitesh.
Yeah, EB5 investor category. Now this is like we discussed, the E2 temporary investment program. This is a permanent investment program. This is permanent residencies. Again, it's a green card category where you invest. Like in E2, we said the minimum threshold is 120, but here the threshold is $1,050,000, $1,050,000. So I don't know what that translates into. Tariq, you wanna?
So I think around 280 is the conversion rate. So that's the so 280.
Okay, to me it translates into a lot of money. I think so. There are some areas which would qualify for a lower threshold of $800,000 also, but it's for the areas where you have a lot of high unemployment. So if you're considering a big city, then you're looking at the investment of $1,050,000. High unemployment areas are usually away from the cities and you are in the middle of nowhere. But as long as you, again, come up with a business plan and it outlines everything, number one, where is the investment going? Number two, where is the money coming from? Again, the chain is very important. What we discussed in the E2, the chain is extremely important because we need to establish and show that where the money is coming from is legitimate source of money. So it's very important. We will need your tax returns, bank statements. If you're getting a gift from family members, we need to know their source of money. We need their tax returns. All sorts of documents are required. So these filings are huge. Okay.
And this is a path for permanent residency. The E2 is a path for temporary work authorization. Very important to keep those two.
But this will give you and your family the green card. The processing time of this is very long. It takes 4+ years, 4 to 5 years to get the conditional green card. So that's very important to know. Even after they approve your initial petition, you have to file a removal of condition, of the application of the permanent green card after 2 years of the expiration of the issuance of the temporary green card. So that's very important. So the whole process may take for final green card from 7 to 8 years or 9 years. That's the timeline. But the initial temporary green card you can get in 4+ years, 4 to 5 years. There's a huge backlog right now for these cases because a lot of investments and people are in line before you, and the government, processes them at their own leisure. They are not in a rush to process these cases. But eventually, if this is all approved, then you and your family, including children, will get their green cards. Again, timing is very important. If your children are approaching 17, 18 years of age, then it's very important that you start this process now. So again, the investment is $1,050,000 for regular areas, 800,000 for the TEA. TEA means targeted employment areas, rural areas, or some specific infrastructure projects. And then you have to create 10 jobs in the US.
Full time.
Full time. So it could be, 5 full time and 10 part time. That's fine. Or it could be 10 full time also. And then, sorry, come again.
Yeah, no, from a practical perspective, I think what Jitesh alluded to, it's, this process could take 4, 5 or more years or more.
Yeah. There are some regional.
There are other avenues. For instance, you could maybe look at coming in as an E2 and then look at EB5 down the road. So
that's what we typically, prefer, and we typically advise people, not to invest the entire amount of $1,050,000 right away. Come here, test the water, invest a little bit, and then get yourself the E2. And if you like the country and if you like where you are, then you can keep on expanding, keep on investing your funds. And one day, if you are able to cross $1,050,000, then you could look at the EB5 option also. But we definitely don't want people to just file the EB5 without even coming here once, because
right.
What if you don't like the area where you are, or the business doesn't flourish the way you thought it would?
Yeah, the takeaway here is
a lot of expense.
Yeah,
running a US payroll is a lot of expense also, and having 10 people on board could mean millions of dollars in expense. So you better be sure of investing such a huge chunk of money before, without being here. So it's a risky endeavor.
I think the appropriate way of doing it. So if you ever actually are, when we assess things, we always look at what are your short-term goals and what are your long-term goals. And then you assess in those sort of two, what paths may be available. Like obviously the long-term goal may be permanent residency, but in the short term, if you're saying, I'm okay to stay in Pakistan until this whole process works out, then that's fine. EB5 could be your path. But if your view is, what, I want to actually be in the US, want to run my company in the US, develop my life here, then you have to explore options. Is the E2 an avenue you want to pursue? Or if you have a company already in Pakistan that's going to expand, maybe instead of any of these, you actually pursue the L1 path and then pursue permanent residency that way. There's a whole host of things that could happen. For instance, you could be here on an E2. Your spouse could actually have work authorization, get involved with a business that's going to sponsor for permanent residency through the perm process. You may actually obtain permanent residency that way without having to invest over $1 million. So, the key is, if the ultimate goal is to get a green card, how can we maybe find a way to get you that green card without actually risking all this money? Right. So you have to kind of look at what path is more beneficial to you. And so it's important, while we're doing this discussion today, I mean, it's in essence fact specific. And so each person's background may be a little bit different and may actually give you a reason to pursue a different path.
Yeah, it's very important. Yes. So there's one aspect, if you could talk a little bit about that. It's relevant to E2 visa as well as EB5, which is source of funds. So what kind of things do you need to show with reference to that?
I mean, listen, to start with, personal savings, people, if they have worked for 5, 10, 15 years, they may have. So if they're okay with the personal savings, if they have that kind of money in their bank account, that's fine. or sometimes people have sold their property also in order to get some more funds. So personal saving, selling off an asset, as long as you can justify, it's fine. If you have a property, then you need to show the entire paperwork. Okay, you had the property and then now you're selling it, you paid the taxes to the local government, all those things. And then, so those are important. Then people have also approached sometimes their family members for gifts or a loan, also from a family member or a friend. If it's coming from a bank or something, then you have to put collateral against it, correct? Because bank is not gonna give the loan without a collateral.
Plus, I think gifts also qualify from family
yeah,
members.
a lot of people from Canada, they get a line of credit against their home, so that also qualifies. So also all sorts of things can qualify as long as you can justify. So personal, you start looking at the personal savings, you know, or selling off one of your assets and then getting the funds from there, or approaching your family members or friends or bank for a gift, loan, etc. Yeah, all sorts of things can happen.
Okay. Priority dates. I think we felt it was important to list it here to give everybody sort of a little bit outline to understand the conclusion of the green card process. And that's, you know, everybody wants to know how quickly permanent residency will be granted. Priority dates are important. So when you file any paperwork with the government, whether it be under the perm process, filing the perm labor certification with the Department of Labor, the date you file it assigns a priority date. If you file a national interest waiver, an extraordinary ability, or any of those filings, when you file with the Immigration Service, the date you file, that is your priority date. And so why is that important? Well, you have to take into this equation the date you filed, your classification you're filing, whether it be an EB1, EB2, or EB3, and last but not least, the person's country of birth. And it's important to understand that it's country of birth, not nationality, because green cards are assigned by country of birth. So what happens is when you get yourself into that line and you have those, you have to look at a chart. And the chart is actually issued by the Department of State. And each month they issue this bulletin. There's actually two charts there. But they create a lot of confusion. For our discussion, we're going to focus on the final action chart. There's a dates for filing chart, which the Department of Homeland Security each month tells us which chart they're going to follow, whether dates for filing or final action. But ultimately, for a person to be granted a green card, their priority date must be current. And so to go back what I just said, priority date is when you actually initially filed paperwork with the government. So what happens is if you look on the left side, you have employment-based first, second, third. There's other workers, religious workers, and so forth. But first, second, and third are normally where you're filing. And then you have China, India, Mexico, and Philippines. Why do we have 4 countries? Those are based on the Department of State. The 4 leading countries that you have the most people right now in line to pursue permanent residency. If we're not born in China, India, Mexico, or Philippines, you actually then fall into all chargeability area. Whenever you see any C's, that references is current, meaning there are no backlogs. So as quickly as you can file certain paperwork, you may actually be able to process the last step of the green card process. So if I'm, for instance, from India and I'm a computer programmer and I'm pursuing the path through perm labor certification, for me to file the last step of the green card process, I would have had to have my employer file and start the paperwork at least before April 15th of 2012. That's how far back we are in that process. Now, if I'm I'm a computer person and I have an employer that did the perm labor certification, if I'm from Pakistan, my priority date, I would have had to have, for me to file the last step of the green card process, the case would have had to start before January 15th of 23. Significant difference. And so I think it's important to kind of understand these things and see that, you know, country of birth has a lot of impact as to how quickly this will process. And this chart, in essence, impacts the 3rd step of the green card process, or maybe the 2nd if it's an extraordinary ability or an outstanding professor researcher. or, national interest waiver, it may impact it differently, but these are the charts. And so you need to, in order to be able to be granted a green card, you have to, number one, file based on how the government tells you on the charts. And second, the priority date needs to be current. Does that make any sense?
Yes, that's very helpful.
Okay.
No, bottom line is it's demand and supply. There's a long line of people standing in front of you when it comes to EB5 log. What we just discussed is the fifth category. It means current. C means current, which means yes, they can accept your application, the last stage of the application, but there's still a line in front of you. Current doesn't mean they're gonna pick up your case tomorrow morning. It means you're in the line, they will adjudicate it whenever the number comes. But for some people, there is a waiting line for 4, 4, 5, 5, 10, 10 years also, especially
Right.
China, India, Mexico, Philippines. Those are heavy countries where they send a lot of immigrants to the US. So there's a longer line for them. For Pakistan, Europe, Canada, there's a shorter line. So
But it's still a line.
there's still a line.
Right. And this bulletin actually is issued each month. And so if you put in, Visa Bulletin, Department of State, you'll actually be able to pull up these charts and you can actually see prior months. And then the next one's going to be, normally they publish this chart a few weeks, maybe 2-3 weeks before the following month. So in the next, it's what, the 6th today.
Around the 15th.
We'll probably see the new chart for July coming out in about a week.
Yeah.
And we use these charts every month. We look at cases and whether we can file the last step or not. Because the other thing we have to contend with is visa retrogression. So what this means is, so let's say I'm current today. Let's say it's, I'm first preference, I'm from Pakistan, I filed an extraordinary ability, and right now it shows as current, C. Next month, it could go backwards. And so what happens is if I'm current, I can file my paperwork, and then the following month it goes backwards. In essence, what the government will do is they'll take my paperwork and put it on a shelf, and they're not going to actually process it until it goes back to current again. So retrogression is it's usually a big impact on retrogression for people who are outside the US waiting in line to process at the consulate. That will have significant delays depending on the retrogression. Or if you have people who are in the US that filed their adjustment of status, the processing of that paperwork will also be affected depending on, same thing, retrogression. Like if it's retrogressed and your priority date is not current, the government is not going to process a green card. Or actually shouldn't, I say that, because we've seen in the last probably 4 years, we've seen a lot of errors where the government was still processing them, even though the priority date was not current. And so they haven't caught up with those folks. But if you've been granted a green card erroneously, usually it's not the government's fault. The government will never take responsibility over it. It's usually the individual's fault. And that's the problem. So ultimately, an error is not in the favor of the person.
Yeah.
As we kind of conclude our discussion today, a couple different things, strategic considerations. Pakistan's obviously moving quicker and not affected per se, but if the situation is where you were born in a country that is backlogged, one thing you could look at is a process called cross-chargeability. If you're married and your spouse is from a country that's moving quicker, you can actually, in essence, say to the government, I'm married to my spouse, he or she was from this country and that country is moving quicker. I want to cross-charge. I want to, in essence, take my spouse's country of birth and apply it to our case so we can go quicker. If a person is in the US, filing permanent residency, if you're far enough along in that process, it allows you to file extensions. We put in as an example an H-1B, which is many times individuals in professional positions are in H-1B status. That allows you to file beyond the 6 years, because normally a person in H-1B has up to 6 years to be in the country. Permanent residency does allow that you can get extensions beyond the 6 years. So there's definitely pursuing permanent residency sooner than later gives you advantages. And so you have to kind of, once again, pre-plan. What do you want from short-term, long-term? And those things are sort of aspects we obviously look at.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah.
Tariq, anybody has any other, Tariq?
So I believe there are no more questions. So I think it's time. Thank you guys for like.
Salman just raised the hand. I don't know if you want to take his question, Salman.
We can always, if you email Tariq, if you have particular
Salman, do you
questions.
want to ask a question?
Oh, you've got others.
Salman, do you want to proceed?
Yeah, probably have to enable, you have to open up your microphone.
No, yeah, he has to do that. Salman needs to do that. Yeah.
Right.
No, okay.
Yeah.
That's
So
fine.
thank you very much for a very elaborate and detailed presentation. It explained a lot of things. It clarified a lot of things for people over here. So this, as planned, this is first of many series which we are planning to do, and we will be back with another session. So Mark and Jitesh, thank you very much for your time.
No,
You're welcome.
Most welcome anytime. And everybody, please feel free to reach out to Mr. Hassan for any follow-up questions you may have. And then we can always gauge your case.
Yeah, it's case specific. So the guidance, this is general in nature. It would be specific to